Hello and welcome. I'm Misha Glenny. It's very nice to see you all here, and believe you me, it's worth your while coming to this, because you're going to hear from Francisco Cantú, who's written this book. This is my very well thumbed copy, called The Line Becomes a River. And it's basically about the US-Mexican border and Francisco's experiences primarily as a border guard. They have a special force there whose primary function is to monitor the illegal crossings of individuals coming from Mexico into the United States for a variety of reasons, but above all, in order to try and find work in the US. And before I ask Francisco about this, it really is I know quite a lot about the drug war in Mexico, and I know quite a lot about the border, but this is written in such a way that it shines lights on areas that you had missed, and it's weaved together with a personal story of tremendous force and really, really nice writing. Someone's got a very good editor. That's what I thought when I was reading this. So I want to start. We're going to get into parts of the book, and I hasten to add what I don't like doing in events like these is giving away everything that's in the book, because people then go away saying, well, I don't need to read the book now because I know everything that's in it. So I'm going to sort of skirt around it a bit and then encourage you all to go off and buy a copy of the book, and if you don't already have it, and get Francisco to sign it for you. So I want to start by looking at this border. It's obviously been in the news over the past couple of years because of Donald Trump's commitment to building a wall. But I want to start by interrogating a little, Francisco, what this border is. When did this border come into being?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the introduction, Misha. So the United States fought a war with Mexico in the 1840s, and in 1848 we signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which Mexico lost, I think, quite near half of their territory. More than half of their territory. 55%. And so, in Arizona, where I live, and in many parts of the American Southwest, there's this sort of adage or saying that many people who trace their lineage in the Southwest back hundreds of years, they say that we didn't cross the border crossed us, which is quite literally true for many of these people who, they went to sleep one day in Mexico and woke up the next and they were in the United States. So, the interesting, there's sort of a research thread that winds through the first part of the book that is about the actual establishment of the border, which actually shifted around a little bit during the first 15, 20 years after the treaty. There was some land purchases that happened that sort of made the line shift. And so, I was very preoccupied in writing this book with sort of what borders we accept as natural and what borders feel to us imposed. Because I grew up as the son of a park ranger, so I grew up very close to the outdoors. And there's, I think, one of the overwhelming feelings that you have when you go to a remote part of the USMexico border is that, I mean, it's quite a simple revelation, but it feels somehow profound when you're standing there, is that this landscape is completely, completely the same on one side of the border than the other, which sounds, of course, quite obvious, but there are places where you can stand and look out across the desert and see this border line etched across the earth, with like big steel 30-foot tall fencing, and then turn around and see, just like a little barbed wire line snaking up into the mountains. And I guess I should also add, just to give a sense of scope, that the distance from, I think, Land's End to John O'Groats is less than half the distance of the US-Mexico border. So when our president talks about building a wall, imagine building a wall from Land's End to John O'Groats and back, and then still having some left over. It's a ridiculous notion.
So it was. So this border emerged in the second half, in its various iterations, second half of the 19th century, and then in the teens and the 1920s, it became the focal point of people wanting to come into the United States illegally, but when it was first in order to find work rather as they do today. But in the first instance, it wasn't Mexicans who were crossing the border, it was Chinese people. So how did that happen?
I think the Border Patrol was established in like 1924 or something. And so, there was sort of our anti-immigrant rhetoric of the day was, as you say, directed at Chinese people. We had a Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first time that the United States instituted a policy regulating in any way immigration into the country. And very shortly after the establishment of the Border Patrol, prohibition happened in the United States. And so you then had smuggling, bootleg liquor from Mexico being smuggled. And so like those were sort of the twin threats of the day.
Yeah. So they established this Border Patrol, which has been in existence ever since, monitoring the comings and goings from Mexico. Fast forward to the present day, or at least to about 10 years or so ago, and you studied and graduated in international relations at university, and most people in the United States, if they'd studied international relations, would go on and work in policy or work in business or work in academia, but you decided to take a different career path. What was that, and why did you do it?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, as you say, the path that was sort of laid before me was, I went to school in Washington, D.C. I had grown up in Arizona in a pretty small town, and I was eager to leave, as many people who grow up in small towns are, to like leave and not look back. And part of studying international relations was, I thought I would travel the world and become a diplomat or something like that. And but I was surrounded by so many people who were like that, and so many people who, just thought they knew everything about everywhere. And you start to that starts to smell off in the classroom. You're like, how does this person from Connecticut know everything about the Iran nuclear crisis or whatever? And so I think, my reaction to encountering that in the classroom and to being in the big city and kind of being a fish out of water was to actually turn my focus back towards where I came from. And so that was the impetus for me to begin studying US-Mexico immigration and border issues. And then I studied abroad, and I did an internship at a migration policy institute. So that was sort of the most likely path for me. But I think because I grew up in the Southwest, and because I had this mother who brought me up, close to the desert, out outdoors. And because, I had a sense for the cultural landscape of the border, I began to feel that a lot of the book learning that I was doing and the policies that I was learning about, were very detached from the actual realities of what I knew growing up there. And so, the idea to join the Border Patrol, I think really stemmed from an obsession with like the line itself, and I wanted to be out on the line. I wanted to see what happened day in and day out.
So I'm just going to stop you there because you just gave away what you did. You went and joined the Border Patrol. So, and I have to say, for people who've been doing international relations at DC, I'm not sure which university you were at.
American University.
At the American University at the AU in DC, which is a relatively liberal atmosphere, and you're all going to the State Department and be do-gooders around the world and so on. The idea that you go back and join the Border Patrol, which is not a fabulously well-paid job, and which is extremely testing in many ways.
I don't know that the State Department is necessarily any better.
Believe me, I've known a
It's
lot
more,
of people.
They don't give you a gun and they're
exactly.
sneakier about everything. But
it's probably a lot more boring. Well, it is a lot more boring, but anyway. But this is a very, very dramatic, to go back and join a law enforcement agency, because of course you are a law enforcement agency, on the border. This is a very unusual step, I would say. Dramatic. So let's just think about. Let's just hear your motives. Because you must have had some misgivings about doing this, whilst also thinking this is something I have to learn. I have to understand.
I had this idea. I think there was a lot of naivete wrapped up in that decision. I mean, I made the decision when I was 22. When I showed up at the academy, I had just turned 23. And I had the idea that if I did something like work in the Border Patrol, because I had all of the same questions that I think many of us are still asking about, immigration reform and border policy and, how to fix it. And I thought that by doing that kind of work, I would get access to some secret knowledge, that I would like see something that had eluded everyone else who hadn't done, who hadn't spent the time on the ground and done that kind of work, and that I would, be able to work in the Border Patrol for 4 or 5 years and leave with this bag of tricks and go on to be, a magical, amazing policymaker or immigration lawyer or something like that. And so, I knew, my mother, first of all, was terrified that I had decided to do this. I think she was, not only concerned for my personal safety as any mother would be, but also for, what the job would require of me and how it would sort of, require me to, risk my spirit in a way. And, I think a lot of young people have this idea of themselves, especially as like in your early 20s, you have this idea of yourself as like a fully formed adult with this like fully formed sense of morals and ethics. And so, I thought I could step into an institution and, and not participate in the bad bits, and be a force for good within the agency, and like work to change it from within, or gather this information that would help me, go on to do something great. And but I think that doesn't give much credit to these institutions, which are really designed from the moment you step into them to sort of break down your sense of who you are as an individual. And rebuild you in the image of a law enforcement agent or a military officer. I mean, the training is very similar. And so I think, when I look back on it, it's alarming how quickly those questions sort of faded away, just out of the need to, wake up every day and show up to work.
But at the same time, when you start working, you have two countervailing forces. You have the relationship that you develop with your colleagues, which obviously become very sort of intense, professional, emotional relationships. But you have that original, motivation of why you went in there, is you wanted to understand the border. But of course, you also had a kind of inherent sympathy for the people who were coming over. And I want to ask you at this point if you could explain to us what your ethnic background is, because of course you're a fluent Spanish speaker, which not everybody in the Border Patrol is. And this, to some extent, sets you apart. But what was your mother's ethnicity and what was your father's ethnicity, and how did that impact on you?
Yeah, my mother, her father crossed the border when he was a young boy. He was brought across by my great-grandparents during the Mexican Revolution, fleeing the violence of the Mexican Revolution. So they really came as refugees, in the same way that many people are still, fleeing the violence of Mexico or Central America. So my mother was half Mexican, but didn't really grow up with my grandfather. So my mother didn't grow up speaking Spanish. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. I learned Spanish in high school and college and studying abroad. So that it makes me a quarter Mexican, which, and it makes me, I guess, like a third generation, a third generation migrant or something. But at that point, it's almost like, is it worth saying? Because in America, of course, everyone is an immigrant, not too many generations removed. But I think that what was surprising to me when I stepped into the Border Patrol is how many people do have Latino heritage or Mexican heritage, or come from explicitly immigrant backgrounds. And a lot of people come from the border region itself. Now less so than before, but I think the Border Patrol is still 40-something% Latino. And at one time, I think until the early 2000s, it was predominantly Hispanic. And so you have a lot of Spanish speakers, you have a lot of sons of migrants whose parents might have crossed the border themselves. And you have a lot of agents that have a sense of the border as a region, as a cultural landscape. And so I was surprised, because I think I probably entered the job with a lot of the same preconceived notions that most Americans have about the Border Patrol, kind of expecting to encounter a bunch of white racists who are stay out and keep them out. But the Border Patrol is the largest law enforcement agency in the United States.
Good God.
And I don't know if that makes it the largest law enforcement agency in the world, but it's probably one of them.
I'm sure China and
right
can come up, but that is very, very significant.
It's significant, and it's also it also means that you have every kind of person imaginable working for this agency. I mean, I worked with agents who were some of the most thoughtful and compassionate, kind people I've ever met. And I also worked with a lot of assholes. I mean, guys who really got off on having a badge and a gun. Yeah. Who are chasing that power.
How do you, just out of interest, how do you handle that when you're working with someone closely who's getting off on the badge and the gun? I mean, that must be a really, really kind of awkward situation to deal with.
When you first show up to the field, you're part of what was called a field training unit. So you're there with several of your colleagues from the academy and some other people who've arrived from other classes who are all new to the station. And that's sort of like a high stakes time because everybody is, they have their ideas about what this work will be, but you're being shown by the senior agents the area that you're going to work and how it's done. And I think a lot of because you're so often working on your own in the Border Patrol or in like very small groups, I think that what kind of agent you are and what kind of agent you're working with sort of makes all the difference in the world. And so I guess when I say that, I think that because a lot of people always quite often get asked the question, like, what's the worst thing you saw another agent do? Did you ever see anybody abusing anyone? And I think because, like, maybe I was the goody two-shoes agent and, like, everybody knew it, and they're like, if you're working with Cantú, don't be an asshole or something like that. I mean, I don't know. I definitely was around agents. I butted heads with some agents who, I would tell them not to speak a certain way around me or to like use a certain language around me, or just tell somebody they're being an asshole. But I think really, people very quickly figure out who is what kind of person.
Sure.
And if you're out in the field with somebody who has a more destructive personality or who's a little bit more of a loose cannon, then they might feed off of each other. Yeah. And if one of those people's partnered up with somebody who's like pretty straight-laced, then they might be pretty straight-laced that day.
Yeah, I mean, on the whole, in the book, you're pretty respectful of those people who you introduce as your colleagues. But I felt on this thing, you're putting a slight distance because, of course, they're all real and they know who they are and they know who you are. And so, and this is always the case when you're writing about people who are still alive, you have to be very sensitive about how they perceive what you're discussing. But I also got the sense that you did develop a camaraderie with some of these characters who you felt were essentially sympathetic in the sort of European simpatico in that sense of sort of decent, likable people.
No, I mean, a lot of these people are people that I'm still friends with, and that I have relationships with, and that I respect. So one of the themes of this book, or I guess one of the questions of this book, is to what extent can we separate an individual from the institution that they choose to become a part of? And that's a question for myself. That's one of the questions that sort of drew me to start writing, to start trying to make sense of what I had participated in, my complicity in an institution that I think perpetuates violent, flawed, deadly policy. And so, I think that, like, yes, there are individual agents who need to be held accountable for their actions, but I think the thing when I look at it now that is most deserving of critique and outside pressure and condemnation and outrage is sort of a broader culture within the Border Patrol that sort of allows for destruction to happen. There is a Wild West mentality that I think, when you're reading some of these scenes, the way that, one of our first days in the field, we tracked down, we were following a group of marijuana mules carrying these big 50-pound backpacks of marijuana through the desert. And they scattered before we caught up to them and left behind not only the drugs, but like a couple backpacks full of personal belongings and belongings to get them through the journey. And the senior agents who were our training agents sort of just like let everyone loose and kind of like gave the okay. And I don't remember if it was ever like specifically communicated or if it was like a wink and a nod. But like all of a sudden, like everyone was like strewing people's clothing on cactus and trees, and like, stepping on food and smoking cigarettes out of the bags. And it was sort of this like strange scene of pandemonium. And it was being taught to us tacitly, right? Like that it is okay to destroy things and strew them out in the desert, and that the desert is also a place that, is a trashy landscape that you can just, trash.
Well, in the book, you do kind of explain that by saying you have to do this so that they're not going to come back and pick up their provisions and their clothes and everything. So there's a kind of justification for that, rather that destructive behavior that's sort of tacitly encouraged.
But it's really it's a twisted logic. I mean, if you look at it, I think it's terribly dangerous logic, and I think what that logic does is teach you that it's that these people's things mean nothing, and so that what does that mean about the people who are carrying them through the desert?
Well, let's talk about that in that case, because of course one of the other things that comes out in the book is that when you're confronted with migrants, usually nothing to do with the narcotics trade, but actually just very poor people trying to get into the United States to seek work. It's clear from the book when you encounter these people that you are completely split because you're doing this job. Your job is to pick them up, to hand them over to the people who process them, who you know are going to deport them back to the United States. But you clearly feel this sort of very deep compassion about their situation and the desperation. And I wondered if that, sort of regular encounters with people who are utterly desperate and, and who latch onto you sort of almost slightly Stockholm syndrome-y ways that, here's somebody who actually says a nice word to me, that must have sort of eaten into your soul over a period of time.
I mean, I think, so when the very first writing that I did that became part of this book really was lifted straight out of these journal entries that I made during the first couple of years of being in the field. And, so for the very first time, a year after leaving this job, I kind of like revisited these journals and took it all out of, these pages and put it into like one computer Word document. And so that was the first time that I looked at all of these encounters in one place. And it felt overwhelming. And I think that, when I looked at that as a piece of writing, it felt important that those encounters would accumulate and overwhelm the reader. Because I think that on a much more gradual scale, that is what was happening to me during that time. Because, after I left the Border Patrol, I mean, even when I came home, just by like writing those encounters down, I think it was an exercise in not wanting to forget.
Sure.
In realizing that like that conversation that I had, I knew that if I didn't write it down, something else weird would happen tomorrow and I would forget about it. And you realize that you're forgetting about people. And you're encountering people at, as you say, they're at probably one of the most vulnerable moments in their entire life. I mean, the people that you're encountering are very often lost. They've very often been lost for days. They've been lost without food or water. They've been left behind by their guides. You encounter people that are at the point of death or dying or dead, and I think that the training doesn't prepare you for the fact that what you're really doing is stepping into this landscape in which like a humanitarian crisis is unfolding, You know, all the tools that you're given, the language that you're given, the mentality that you're given is of law enforcement. And it's almost, you know, it's like it's a lot of the language is the language of warfare, quite frankly. And a lot of times your colleagues are people who are coming from, you know, a lot of prior soldiers are like getting jobs as Border Patrol agents. Sure. So that mentality is necessary when you know, when you are encountering, I don't know, groups of armed drug smugglers or something like that. But most often, you know, you're encountering refugees.
Well, I wanted to move on to that now about what is the perceived threat in the United States from Mexico. And of course, what has happened is you've had a kind of collapsing of two very different things. One is the labor migration, which accounts for the overwhelming majority of people who are trying to cross the border. And then, of course, there is the emergence after the turn of the century and in the past 10, 15 years of these incredibly powerful drug cartels who challenge successfully the Mexican state in large parts of Mexico, are incredibly violent, incredibly corrupting, and of course they're making huge amounts of money because of the fact that the United States consumes 40% of the world's cocaine output, despite only having 5% of the world's population. And so you have these impossible forces that the Border Patrol is there to engage with. And of course, you know that those people who are in the cartels, who as a Border Patrol person you will occasionally come across, are the most amoral, ruthless killers you're ever likely to encounter anywhere in the world. So that, you know, tension that you're dealing with very poor, desperate people who just want to, you know, sort of clean cars or clean toilets or work in a pizza restaurant or do the most, you know, menial work in order to sustain their family in Mexico, and some of the nastiest people in the world, that must really screw with your head.
Yeah, and I think, you know, especially, you know, before that encounter, you don't know what, you know, when you're tracking a group of, you know, you're tracking a group of 7 people, but they're like heat signatures on some faraway camera, and you don't know, you know, when your backup is 30 minutes away and you're, I don't know, like 2 hours on foot from the nearest road, you don't know what that encounter is going to be until it happens. And so I guess that's where the paramilitary training kicks in. But I think, you know, like after stepping out of that role, you know, when you look at even like the policy changes and the ways that these dynamics have shifted in the last few decades, I mean, what you see is that you know, human smuggling used to be quite different from drug smuggling. These used to be separate operations. But as we've tightened our borders, as it has become more and more difficult to cross the border, it has also become more and more profitable to smuggle people across it. And so these same cartels that you're talking about, you know, saw an opening and stepped in and took over the human smuggling trade as our policies became more strict. And so the price has gone up. And, you know, if you look at who loses in all of these scenarios, it's always the migrant. You know, the migrant's body is commodified from the moment they leave their doorstep. And you also look at, I mean, I think it's true that a significant proportion of the people that are coming across the border are economic migrants, but more and more and more, you know, these are people who are leaving war-torn countries in South America, or not officially war-torn, but gang wars. And you look at the U.S. policies that have allowed that to happen, and that have. So actually, last year was the first year that Central American migrants overtook Mexican migrants as the highest proportion of people crossing the border. And the people that are coming from Central America are most often fleeing very specific gang threats in their village, where they are looking at a situation where it's leave or face certain death or like join this gang. And so I think more and more you see people that are not recognized as refugees. Like we won't bestow asylum status onto them, but that's really what they are. They're asylum seekers.
Exactly. It's something that I've been doing recently. I've been working on Brazil quite a lot. I wrote a book about Brazil, where we have 60,000 homicides every year in Brazil. Now, if this were somewhere in the Middle East, the United Nations would designate this as a civil war, because the rate of homicides is basically off the scale. But because it's not, because it's to do with inequality, poverty, to do with the war on drugs and so on and so forth, it's not designated as a civil war. And so these people, I mean, Honduras, for whom now San Pedro has the highest homicide rate in the whole world, obviously people are going to be running from San Pedro, because if they stay, there's a good chance they'll get killed. On that issue of the discrepancy between various places and human security in various places, let's have a look at somewhere which features in your book, and a place that I find absolutely fascinating when I visited there last year, which is the conglomeration of El Paso in the United States, from western Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, which is the largest city in Tijuana, which is right opposite. It looks like one city. So if you're in El Paso, you go up, you can go up in an elevated way as you go north. You can look down, and somewhere in the middle, although you can't see it from a distance, is the border. And so this is a huge, huge conglomeration, which is the largest, apparently I'm told, the largest bilingual urban conglomeration in the world. And when I looked at it, knowing that Ciudad Juarez was one of the most violent towns, cities in the whole world, if not at one point the most violent city, because of the cartels, because of the cocaine smuggling, it reminded me, and the people who lived there, who all wanted to come, or lots of whom wanted to come and work in the United States, and half of their family lived in El Paso because they had migrated 30, 40, 50 years ago or whatever, but they couldn't come and visit them. It reminded me of East and West Berlin during the Cold War. Is you can look at this place and you know that the people are stuck there, in terms of East Berlin, in a world of sort of oppression, in terms of Ciudad Juarez, in a world of blood, basically. And yet, explain this to me, Francisco, that El Paso has the lowest rate of homicide of major urban areas in the United States. So you have one of the most peaceful, by American standards, cities in the north, and then this sort of barely visible border, and then one of the most violent. How did that come about? And what was it? What was your experience of El Paso, Ciudad Juarez?
I mean, my experience, so I lived there during the last, I guess, 8 months that I spent in the Border Patrol. I mean, I guess what's most interesting to me about Ciudad Juarez and El Paso is the sort of mental and spiritual disconnect that happens, that I think everyone who lives in El Paso and does not cross the border or does not have, a family tie on the other side of that line, that everyone. You describe the scenery of this place very well, and I think that something about the physicality of like driving across the freeway to work in El Paso and like looking out at the mountains right there. There's like there's big writing on the mountains that like beckons you to look at it in Ciudad Juarez, and so you look at it every day. And you realize that you are so disconnected from what's happening in that city.
And it has an evangelical message.
Yes, Ciudad Juárez lee la Biblia, or la Biblia es la verdad, léela. So Ciudad Juárez, the Bible is the truth. Read the Bible. Yeah. Just looming over the city at all times, both cities. And so I think that to me the disconnect. Susan Sontag, in her book regarding the pain of others, writes about, I think she is citing another journalist's work, somebody who was covering the wars in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s. And she writes about this woman who would have her dinner every night in her living room while watching the evening news. And this journalist, would watch this woman. She'd watch evening news, and the evening news would be about, a village that's being sacked, 50 miles away.
Right, yeah.
And then, like progressively during a week or something, that violence grows closer and closer to this woman's doorstep, to where, like she's eating dinner with the same peace and quiet and routine as every day, and watching news of like the next village closest to hers being burned to the ground. And that kind of disconnect is the kind of disconnect that happens every day. I mean, even when I was living there, I would not read the news, almost like intentionally, almost as like protection. I wouldn't read the news of what was happening in Ciudad Juarez, and I knew well, because I had sort of been obsessed with Ciudad Juarez as a metaphor before living there, and I think I probably thought less about it while I lived there, or at least I read less about it when I lived there than I did, before coming there. And so I don't these are just questions. None of these are answers. I'm not really explaining why any of this exists, but what I think it speaks to is the disconnect with which we look at our border as Americans. I mean, I think we are extremely disconnected from what happens, just on the other side of our line. And I think that, we are implicated in what happens there. It is our immigration policy, our drug policy, our foreign policy, but we refuse to look at it. And so we keep recycling the same old arguments. The argument that we're hearing right now to build a wall and to hire more border agents is the same argument that was happening a decade ago when I was in college and I was studying all this. We passed a Build the Wall bill. It was quite literally the Build the Wall bill of 2006. It was called the Secure Fences Act. And we have since constructed 700 miles of borders and fencing that people seem to have forgotten about. They forget that it's there. And all that has done is pushed the crossings out further and further away from our sight and our thinking. And people lose their lives in great numbers in the most remote parts of our desert. And we don't talk about their deaths. We don't read about it. We don't acknowledge it.
Yes, that's some of the most affecting parts of your book, about talking about the anonymous corpses straddling the border, right across the border. Before I hand over to questions from the audience, there's one thing which I thought, I have to say, not only is this book very, very illuminating, but it's some very, very elegant and extremely moving writing. And I was struck from the very, very beginning, obviously, about your metaphor of the wolf, based on a rather positive myth about St. Francis of Assisi. And yet when the wolf recurs in your book, it's all in various forms and through various dreams and so on. It's almost as though rather than being the positive message of St. Francis of Assisi, I thought that you felt that it was something coming to destroy you, that the border, as I haven't explained yet, but the final third of the book changes tone very dramatically and talks about the particular story of a man who Francisco encountered after he had left the Border Patrol. And I'm not going to give anything away from it because you really need to read this final, you need to read the first 2/3 to make the final third any sense of it. But when you read it halfway through, it just kicks you in the stomach. And your metaphor of the wolf, which begins ambiguous and then becomes positive, by the end, I felt that the wolf was devouring you and that you found it very difficult to cope with the implications of what you'd understood both in the Border Patrol, but also, what you felt about the condition américaine, basically.
It's funny that a big reason that this image of the wolf figures so prominently in the book is that there was quite literally one dream about a wolf that made that really shook me, and I'd been having bad dreams, nightmares for ever since I sort of started doing the work, and I pushed them aside and didn't talk about them, and I would write them down sometimes, but I wouldn't really process it, and I think. That dream of the wolf made such an effect on me that after I left the Border Patrol, I think one of the very first things I did was start reading about dream psychology and dream symbolism and everything from like Freud and Jung to those like chintzy websites where it's like, what does it mean when you dream of a wolf? Like, And I was sort of like, I had this investigative impulse to make sense of like that particular dream.
But I think it was interesting that it linked back to the story that your mother told you about St. Francis.
And that's not a connection that I made until like years later. And all of a sudden, like out of the void, I remembered my mother reading me this story of St. Francis and the wolf. And actually, the writing of Jung helped me make a lot of sense of this, where Jung writes a lot about the unconscious and our dreams as like this reflection of sort of our shadow self. And when I started thinking about that wolf emerging from this shadow self that with which I was not doing much reckoning, with which I was pushing that self aside. I began to think really about how the construct of borders encourages us to do that as a society, and we are being encouraged by our rhetoric to see the other side of this border as a shadow, and the people that come from there as part of this indistinguishable mass of people that are the other. And Jung wrote very amazingly during the Cold War about the Iron Curtain as sort of like a metaphor for the consciousness of an entire society, and I think that the border between the United States and Mexico sort of is that same metaphor to me today.
Well, Francisco, thank you very much for that. I'm sorry we've gone sort of rather over time. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be questions, but it reflects on, I think, the multiplicity, the multiple layers on which this book works. It's not just an everyday story of Border Patrol folk. It's much, much more than that. But now I can happily throw it open to the audience. So if you've got any questions, if you could keep them as questions, I'd be very, very grateful, and I can also be very ruthless about stopping that. So, Madam.
Thank you very much. I've read a lot of your book so far, and this has been a great discussion. I was very struck by the way you described the kind of mayhem that would break out amongst the Border Patrol colleagues, the looting and the pillaging and just misbehavior of various kinds. And I've worked on police forces for decades, and there's a kind of managed violence. And what is interesting is, when do the authorities decide that a certain instance of that managed violence is going to be punished, disciplined, criminally prosecuted, and other times totally ignored, as though there's a consciousness of this form of managing hyper-testosterone males with guns?
I really I appreciate that term, managed violence. I think that's a very apt term to describe what you see in a lot of police forces. And I've been thinking a lot about this question because in the US there was some footage that came out maybe a month ago or 6 weeks ago of Border Patrol agents kicking over water bottles, dumping out water bottles that had been left by humanitarian aid groups in the desert for people making the journey through the desert. And of course, and I touch on, and we touched on the sort of logic that is passed down from your higher ups in the Border Patrol that sort of allows for a permissive environment for that to happen. And there was a lot of outrage when that video came out. And I think that the official response was quite predictable. It was like, oh, we have a policy against this, it's against policy, those were a few bad apples. But of course, I don't think that those people were ever actually punished. And I think what becomes more important to examine is not the policy that the Border Patrol has, because it can look very good on paper, but what overrules policy always is the culture of an institution, is the culture between agents when they're out in the field on their own. Because even more so than like an urban police force, who's going to hold these people accountable in the middle of the desert in the middle of the night? Far from any camera or street neighborhood or witnesses or anything. What's going to prevail always in those situations is sort of the culture of the institution and the personal kind of dynamic between specific agents. And so I think that that's what has to change. There's this Wild West mentality that I alluded to earlier that comes from the fact that the Border Patrol was established during the 1920s and that these guys were all on horses and chasing bootleggers. But that mentality has to die. And I think that it is necessary not only for certain individuals to be made an example of, right, by actually prosecuting or suffering some sort of consequence for their actions, but it's even beyond that, it's necessary for the public to be outraged and to sustain that outrage. Because I think the danger is that, a video comes out, it gets passed around on social media, and then we all forget about it. And we move on to the next thing. And then, the Border Patrol, they've made their statements, but nobody is still banging on their door asking for accountability. So I think, especially in the quick-moving media world of today, we need to sustain outrage. I don't know, set a reminder in our phone to knock on the Border Patrol's door every 3 months.
But this is also actually where the issue of leadership comes in as well, because if you have a president who, as a candidate, was referring to the Mexicans as bad hombres and rapists and so on, they send all the bad people up here. We need a wall. We need to increase the number of people in Border Patrol. The message that sends down to the institution of the Border Patrol, and indeed the communities who live around the Border Patrol is that it's okay to behave really, really, really badly. So it is both, it's a kind of, it's how that institution perceives itself, but if you're getting messages from the very top that is saying you can be real bastards, then any attempt to sort of reform and improve that institution is made all the more difficult, I would have thought. Thank you, Matt, for that question. Anyone else?
Thanks very much. I had a question about the writing process itself and how you came up with the structure that you did and in what order kind of things got written.
Yeah, so the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section really deals with sort of the training process, from the academy to, going out into the field, sort of like the first the first year of being an agent. The middle section deals with sort of the intelligence work. I left the field and went into intelligence, and so that's where a lot of this research and thinking about, sort of like the larger socio-political issues in history between Mexico and the US and drug policy and that sort of thing comes up. And then the third section takes place years after I left the Border Patrol and really follows the story of this friend. And the story of Jose began unfolding after I had already started writing this book. So I had sort of like conceived of, I was in school, I was getting a degree in creative writing, and I knew that I wanted to write about this time in the Border Patrol, but it would have been, I think, a very different book. There would have been no third part. And I think that, what happened when this began happening to someone I knew, and when I became close to to Jose's family, and I was sort of looking for the very first time behind this curtain at what happened, at what would happen to every individual that we arrested in the desert. And you send them, and you don't know. You know that they're stepping into this other phase of their experience or exit, but you don't know what that looks like. And so it opened my eyes to like the vast deportation industrial complex of America, if you will. And it is vast, and it is sort of designed to obfuscate to the people who are trapped in it and to their families what's happening and when and where and why. And I think that you can know all of these things are happening, but to see it happen to a friend and to have a personal involvement with somebody who's experiencing that really changes, I think, the whole equation, the whole way that you think about it.
Now, don't give too much away here.
I won't give any more away.
Because you really need to read this.
But what I will say as a little tie-in to that is, I think that, to me what that means is that we have to engage with the people in our communities who are most directly affected by, border policy and immigration policy, because they have absolutely the most to tell us. Like, what opened my eyes more than working for the Border Patrol was seeing this story unfold to someone I cared about.
But they are the ones without the voices. So that's the irony, is they have most to tell, but they have no way of articulating it. Or, you came along, and it was, very, very fortunate. But Jose otherwise would not have had a way of articulating that.
But I think that's sort of like that's what we tell ourselves as writers, right? But I think that it also shows us like where we need to move as a society, and as like the industry, like the publishing industry, like giving a platform to those voices, and listening to those voices in our community, and like what we choose to do. Like in America, after Trump was elected, I think like the International Rescue Committee, the main refugee assistance charity in the United States, like their donations surged, which is wonderful. They do really important work, but I think more important than giving than giving money, because it's easy to give money and feel good about yourself. But what's more important than feeling good about yourself is like showing up with your time and your attention, to someone else. So like, use that money to bail someone out of jail, or to find someone, help find someone a lawyer, or to just like ask questions and listen, because I think, even in this country, right? Like we all know people who, whether we realize it or not, have some connection to this like madness. And our kids are going to school with their kids, and migration is intricately woven into our society.
Yeah. Great, Francisco. That's an excellent point to end on. And it now leaves me only to exhort everybody in the room to go and buy a copy of The Line Becomes a River.
You're a great salesman. You really you like hit it in the beginning, the middle, and the end.
You know what? It's because I'm a writer as well. But really, you're not going to be disappointed by this book. This is a really terrific piece of work, and I can't recommend it highly enough. And Francisco, you've done a great job. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
For coming.